One of your major research interests over the last 16 years or so has been in psychotherapy. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that interest came about.
Looking back, I've got things projects I've done on both psychotherapy and working on the communication of people with intellectual disability, and they've both been very engaging things for me to work on. In both cases, I've benefited greatly from working with colleagues who are much more expert in both of those two areas than I am, with Ivan Lojdar in thinking about psychotherapy, and later on with Anssi Perakala and the Finnish group in thinking about psychotherapy as well. And with intellectual disability, working with my colleague Mick Finlay and Chris Walton at Lancaster, who are, again, much more expert in intellectual disability than I am. And my contribution in those, such as it was to be able to take a backward step away from the engagement with the frontline participants, the psychotherapists, the psychotherapeutic clients, the support workers, the people with intellectual disability, and think about how they did their business with each other. Now, of course, it's two very different settings, two very different clientele, two very different kinds of support being offered. But the common thread in both is there's some degree of disorder in the communication. The disorders of different kinds, to be sure. In psychotherapy, it's a disorder of emotion, sort of affect, which is preventing the person expressing her or himself in a way that they want to express themselves, and is oriented towards changing the way they think about themselves and therefore what they express and how they express it. It's a very different kettle of fish with intellectual disability, because the variety of problems that the person will have is much broader and speaks to some kind of cognitive deficit, not an affective deficit, but a cognitive deficit. So the job of the person who's supporting them is to try and feel her or his way to seeing what it is the person's trying to say, and support them in saying it in a clearer, more socially acceptable way. And that's tough. It's tough for all concerned. Because in both cases, in both practitioner cases, the psychotherapist on the one hand and the support worker on the other hand, or whatever interlocutor, be it he or she or a family member or some other paid employee, brings into the conversation their own sophisticated everyday understanding of what conversation is like. Now, the psychotherapist has got extensive training in actually damping down that conversation, everyday conversational competence, and not using her or his routines, which they would normally do, and would normally immediately come to her or his mind if they were listening to somebody and speaking to them. For example, if you're listening to a trouble as an ordinary friend, you'd have a certain range of repertoires in how to deal with that trouble. But the psychotherapist is badly served if he or she uses those everyday routines, because that's not her or his job. Her or his job is to probe, not to be merely sympathetic, but not to challenge in a way that shuts the person up, but to challenge in a way that gets the person thinking and gets the person talking and mobilises the kinds of resources the person or himself can use. Now, those are very different practices from their everyday practices, and then the successful psychotherapist will be able to disengage her or himself from her or his everyday practices. Now, that's much more difficult for a support worker dealing with someone with intellectual disability, because usually, we're talking about people who aren't trained in communication. The support worker in the front line looking after someone with intellectual disabilities has been trained, I'm afraid, in rather rudimentary ways, according to her or his job description. So he or she might be a residential support worker, and her or his first job is to maintain the integrity of the place in which the person lives. So they've got some custodial issues to do with health and safety, to do with management of food, with management of hygiene and so on. And in their training there's not a great deal of communication. So when they come to be talking with or listening to or interacting with the person with some real cognitive deficits and expressing her or himself or comprehending what's being said to her or him, then the frontline staff person finds it hard not to simply respond as they would to a neurotypical person. But it's no good asking a person with intellectual disability the question you'd ask a neurotypical person, because he or she hasn't got the competence to deal with them. Nor is it any good responding to them if they say something in a way that, and so on and so forth. So one of the interests I've had with my colleagues is to see how it is that the person with limited communication training does cope and does her or his job. And you find that what they do is that, well, there's many things they could do. I shouldn't be talking about it in such detail. But one of the interests to me is bring in conversation analysis to the picture to see in more minute detail how it is that a person with this comparatively short amount of training manages to do her job. And on the other side of the coin, how it is that somebody with very limited communication abilities, by dint of her or his cognitive difficulties, manages nonetheless to do what they want to do, or in some cases get balked in doing what they're to do. And conversation analysis, because of its minute analysis and its egalitarianism, as you like, in taking both sides of the interaction equally seriously, can shed light where a much less detailed analysis is going to struggle to discover what exactly is going on.
So, in addition to being a member of staff here in the Department of Social Sciences, you're also editor of the journal Research on Language and Social Interaction, displayed up there. I was just wondering how that came about, how you originally became editor of that journal.
Well, I was lucky enough to be invited by the previous editor, Christine Fitch, an old colleague of mine and a friend of DARG, to be an associate editor of the journal Research on Language and Social Interaction as an ordinary reviewer. And then as more and more conversation analytic papers, submissions came in, more and more would be put my way. And eventually Christine, to her credit, realised that there was a tide flowing towards conversation analysis in the submissions to the journal, and felt that if there was to be a new editor, it would be somebody with those kinds of interests and those kinds of willingness to review those things. And eventually she made me both a joint editor, effectively, and then when she stepped down, she recommended I be made editor, and the publishers were happy with that, so I took over from her in, I think it was 2008.
And obviously ROLSI publishes a wide variety of research. I was just wondering if you could define a single feature of what makes a ROLSI article. What would that be?
ROLSI has changed over the years, and if you look back over its history, it started as a very vanguardish, open to all journal of the fringes, the contact points of linguistics, sociology, philosophy, communication studies, and psychology. And it was home to a wonderful variety of different kinds of people who didn't have a natural home elsewhere in the existing journals at the time. Over the years, it became more established and found its own home, and it became a forum for a smaller variety, but nonetheless a variety, of people who wanted to say something about language in use in the social world. That still covered quite a large ground, and there would be room for discourse analysts, rhetoricians, pragmatists, communication studies people with an interest in pragmatics and philosophical linguistics, and increasingly things to do with interaction studies. And as interaction studies became crystallized into conversation, well, not all of it, but a strong theme in interaction studies was using conversation analysis, that eventually became the dominating force in submissions. And over the years, I think it's fair to say now that most articles in most issues of most volumes of the journal tend to be conversation analytic. It's not to say that there's no home now for other kinds of language and interaction studies. There is. But the centre of gravity is very much shifted towards a study of conversation, of interaction, multimodal, conversational, using many, many different kinds of media, which pays close attention to the sequential unfolding of interaction. And that has meant that a more discoursey, texty, less shall we say, micro approach to interaction has tended to fall away. And people who would have published in ROLSI, say, 15 years ago, now find themselves in other journals and other venues. But to balance that up, people who were trying to publish in Conversation House in other journals and not getting very far 15 years ago now find, I think, much more of a home in research on language and social interaction.
So looking back over all the research that you've done over the years, obviously it's a very diverse body of work. Is there a single core unifying interest that you can see there that's underlay at all?
Well, I guess I remember that, if you remind me, I'm a social psychologist. Now, to remind myself that I teach social psychology and my training was in social psychology. So I guess I found myself backing into a place on the social psychological stage which is illuminated by talk. And that's the kind of thing which I guess was always part of my interest when I was even a postgraduate. I remember doing my PhD 1 million years ago when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, and finding myself starting out being interested in what was then quite fashionable at the time, something called attribution theory, which young people like yourselves will never have heard of because it's now completely left the scene. And the notion there was you get people to rate items on a scale of 1 to 5 on how true or false something was, and from there infer the way they saw the world. Now, you may giggle and laugh at that, and you're entitled to do so, but this was big. The way that social psychology proceeded at the time probably still does in some cases. It does seem to us strange. And it seemed to me rather strange, but only halfway through my thesis. So I decided to become more discoursive, and I didn't know what that was at the time. So I went out and listened to what people said and wrote it down. I didn't think of recording them at all, but I was still young at the time. And eventually I wrote a thesis based on this discoursive stuff that people were doing. But I had a terrible crisis of confidence, thinking, well, surely this won't work. There's no experiments here. I'm not going to get my thesis, my PhD. So I quickly went and did some terrible experiments, and I wrote them up. And I thought, well, at least that will get me my PhD, and I'll be all right. So I duly bundled the two things together, and I sent them off to my external examiner and my internal examiner, and we had our viva a few months later. And we were going through the discoursive stuff, and they were nodding away happily. Well, this is rather interesting, Charles. This discourse analysis seems to be doing you quite a lot of good, and you're finding things out about how people explain the world, and that's very helpful. But tell us, why did you do these rather stupid experiments at the end of it? So, collapse of start party, and I had to admit that I thought I wouldn't get the thesis without it, and they said, well, poo-poo, you shouldn't have done these. So why don't we just forget the last 200 pages, I think it was, of experiments, and we'll just stop here, and so well done, Dr. Antaki. And I think that set me on the road to think, well, perhaps I should be interested in talk rather than questionnaire items and answering things on a scale.
So, and again, looking back over all the research that you've done, is there any single piece of research or research project that you're particularly proud of?
I've enjoyed them all. I've enjoyed working with my colleagues, who, as I say, are much more expert in particular domains that I've been working in. Intellectual disability, psychotherapy now with police interviews and so on and so forth. And the interest has always been in how do these people bring off what they're doing with each other. And you can't help but look at any new piece of information, new piece of data, be it video or audio, and think to yourself, my goodness, that's brilliant. People doing their everyday jobs, people doing their everyday interactions with each other, using the subtlest of methods to get across the most nuanced of messages, and carry off just their everyday social being by dint of their competence and their sophistication in using talk. It's been a pleasure to be involved in and seeing, and if I can, as I have done, get the kind of insights which Conversation House has been able to provide. That's given me a great deal of satisfaction, and it's the kind of thing which I must have been aware of dimly when I was starting out, but I'm very pleased to have done it and reached the point where I can feel that I've discovered things about the social world which have been interesting to me, and being the kinds of things that I can contribute to what we know about how people do effectively what is, at the end of the day, social psychology.
So if we can just step outside of academia briefly, what are your interests, non-academic interests?
Well, like any academic, I enjoy the printed word, and so reading and writing and those kinds of things are fun. And also seeing things somewhat differently by looking at ways of, well, again, it's a rather academic way of thinking about it, but nevertheless, you go to some piece of art or performance, like a film or a gallery, you'll see the world in a different kind of way. And that can be both enjoyable aesthetically and also liberating, and also brings you back to the ways you think academically about the world. About how is it possible that we do what we do in the way that we do it, and see things in ways which are both individual and yet manage to communicate with other people. And that's an abiding interest both in academic and in non-academic ways of being engaged with the world.
And finally, I'd just like to ask you about what you're currently working on and what your plans for the future are.
Sure. Well, like any researcher, there's tons and tons of data which I haven't analysed yet, so they are still waiting to be pulled out of the drawer, put on the screen and gone through. Of course, that kind of thing takes time. So I'm still working on data from both intellectual disability and police interviews. Now there's working with police data coming from body-worn cameras, and working with a group of people on intellectual disability, including people who themselves do have an intellectual disability and who are advocates of and for other people, and who bring into the mix the kind of experiential understanding of what their interactions are like, which is impossible for somebody who hasn't experienced that to get a sense of themselves. So that'll be an exciting new venture.
Well, those are all the questions I had, so thank you very much again.
Thank you, Joe.
Interview.